Hi everybody, this is Andrea Hollifield. I'm going to be taking you guys through my final project, which was incorporating 21st century learning objectives in social studies using Padlet. So I'm going to jump right in and I'm going to read through my 21st century learning objectives. So the goal for this project was for students to collaborate and have conversations about key civil rights leaders and events and how they believe those people impacted the overall cause of civil rights. So that was the collaboration objective. For critical thinking, students will be analyzing primary and secondary sources in order to determine the effect that different people and events had on the outcome of the civil rights movement. And then for close reading and comprehension, students will read and analyze those primary and secondary sources, reading with the specific lens of determining the impact of those key people and events and what their impact was on the civil rights movement. So then I had some academic learning objectives and then some overall objectives. So the standard that I chose to focus on was to describe the importance of key people, events, and developments between 1950 and 1975. So that's sort of the overall umbrella that this standard falls into. And then my general learning objective for this project was for students to be able to describe the sacrifices made by important figures of the civil rights movement, like MLK, Thurgood Marshall, the Rosa Parks, and explain the sacrifices that they made and how they were key in changing the law about segregation and racism. In addition to that, students will be able to understand that Jim Crow laws and segregation lasted for many years, and it's difficult to make them illegal in the United States. So some of the materials and tools and activities that I'm using are Padlet, so that's kind of my main tool that I'm using. I'm using some resources from YouTube, News ELA, and I'm also using Google Docs for the final outcome. So this is a Web 2.0 experience that sort of guides students in reading different resources that have information about the 1960s with an emphasis on critical thinking and collaboration. So the assignment itself is all compiled in one Padlet site, but students work at their own pace to read, view, and analyze those resources. Some of the times they work with partners and sometimes they work independently. And they did have a whole week to finish working on all the resources, and they did have the option to complete work at home so that they could stay on track in terms of timing, but that was completely optional. In order to provide those students with that appropriate idea, I did go ahead and model one set of the resources for the student. So I chose the Brown versus Board of Education resources, and I modeled looking at the resources for that topic, critically thinking about it and analyzing how that new information supports or contradicts their previous thoughts and knowledge about the civil rights movement. So the big question that I answered was, how did the result of Brown versus Board of Education impact the outcome of the civil rights movement? So we sort of, I gave students some success criteria for that. So sort of what their answers should look like when they're working independently. So once students left the comments under each of those resources on the Padlet page, they went through and read comments on other students' responses. So basically the Padlet was organized in a way that each topic or resource or each topic had a set of resources underneath them, and then students answered the questions right underneath the resources that were linked. So they would either agree or disagree with the original comment and then add insight of their own thinking. When students finished with the Padlet page, my original idea was to have them choose the top 3 events or people that they believed to have had the most impact on the civil rights movement. So they wrote an opinion essay that explains why they believed those events had the most impact, and they used those sources from Padlet to back up their claims with evidence. And that essay was used to evaluate their overall learning throughout the whole unit. And I was able to pilot part of this project, and there were definitely a few teachable moments and some things that I would change moving forward. But overall, I think it went relatively well. I really only piloted the Padlet portion of the project where students were analyzing those primary and secondary sources, and they were able to work independently, and they worked great with partners. But I didn't have time to pilot the final essay. So one of the biggest pieces that needed redesigning was the structure of the Padlet itself. I ended up creating this project on one big Padlet. So I had all of the resources and all of the topics on the one Padlet page. And I found that a lot of students were confused about where to go next. They were just a little bit overwhelmed. So I think moving forward, I would create a Padlet for each of the topics and then upload the resources for each topic inside its own page. I also had some technical difficulties. Some of the students' Chromebooks just wouldn't pull up some of the YouTube videos that I had found, and that just happened because of some county regulations. So moving forward, I think I would definitely need to find some other way to link the videos, maybe using Safari Montage or SafeShare, and then just screen record the videos maybe and save them myself. So that was definitely a big issue that I ran into while we were working through the pilot. And although I didn't get an opportunity to finish that final assessment portion of the essay or of the project with the essay, I do think it was an overall success in terms of being a learning experience. Students had rich conversations. They talked about topics like the wide acceptance of racism in the United States, the negative effects that we still see today in society due to Jim Crow laws and segregation, and also people thinking that the civil rights movement made everything right, even though we still do see racism today. They talked about people being bystanders during this time, and they talked about the compliance of the government in racism and segregation. So they had some great high-level thinking conversations, and I used those as a formative assessment. So the students that I found that weren't really understanding those things, those students would receive a little bit more intervention during the project. But the majority of them were able to make those connections on their own. So I think that the overall learning targets were mastered by most of the class. I wanted to find a platform where I would be able to embed those primary and secondary sources in an organized way. So that's really why I chose Padlet. I felt like it was a really good way to organize the information, although like I said before, next time I would probably split it up a little bit differently and have each topic have its own Padlet page. And this really worked for me because my school adopted one-to-one Chromebooks this semester, so my students really became troubleshooters, and they just found this to be a really easy way to work through this project as opposed to having paper copies or having to go to a computer lab. And their Google accounts are linked to all the sites, so they were able to really navigate through different sites like Padlet and Newsela and Google Classroom, and they were able to go from each account very easily. So it was a very smooth transition between tools. And I did implement this project right after we had our civil rights unit, and we had actually taken a field trip to the Center for Civil and Human Rights. So my students had a lot of background knowledge that they were able to connect to these primary sources, and they were genuinely engaged by it just because they had had that real life experience of visiting that center. So some last minute information. I chose Newsela for a lot of the topics because of the ability to differentiate so easily within that website. Students read passages that are on their level, and they still get the information that they need without having to find different sources from different websites. Students also worked in some strategic groups where ELLs, so English language learners, and some lower level readers were working with higher level readers, so that they could really help each other with comprehension and content vocabulary. They also had access to online dictionaries and translators and things like that. And of course, I was always available as a resource for any questions that they might have had. Like I said, for formative assessments, I really just listened to their conversations and read the comments that they had left and used that to sort of guide my next steps in instruction. And of course, as they worked on the Padlet, I conferenced with them in order to discuss their progress on the objectives. So as they worked, if I found that they weren't really meeting the standard, I would definitely have conversations with them along the way. And that is about it. Thank you so much for listening.